Hey everybody, welcome back to another JBoz gaming video. I'm your host JBoz, and today we're going to talk about tiers and matchmaking. And so let's talk about tiers and matchmaking as it relates to World War II. I'm going to go into the World War II game mode. I'm going to go to the main garage screen, and in here there's going to be obviously our carousel of tanks. I'm going to clear my filters so that we can just talk about these a little bit. And as we do this, and I've mentioned in previous videos that in World War II there are different tiers, and they group the tanks into different tiers, based on their strengths and weaknesses and so on. There is tiers 1 through 10. Low tiers is considered, and you'll hear people refer to, I play lower tiers or I play higher tiers, and that just means they're kind of even grouping these tanks even into a larger group. In that, usually lower tiers are considered tiers 1 through 5. If you're a new player, you actually start with tanks in tier 3. So tiers 1 and 2 may even be completely hidden from you because you wouldn't be able to acquire these tanks unless they were awarded to you from Wargaming through some special scenario, or they, for some reason, sell them in the store, as they have occasionally in fairly recent past. But anyway, generally you won't start with tiers 1 and 2 tanks, and they won't be available to you to select. So really tiers 3, 4, and 5 will be the tiers that you would focus on. That's unfortunate, and that's a whole other video, but upper tiers are the tiers above 5, so 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So along with these tiers, the game World of Tanks uses these to kind of match make a particular, or put a particular team together and create a battle, hopefully a more fair battle. So they use the tiering system to group these tanks together, and then you kind of learn what these tanks can and cannot play against based on how Wargaming has constructed their matchmaker, or the system that basically creates the matches and determines who's on each side of the match. In this example, or really what I want to show you is an example of a particular tank card. In this case, I've just quickly filtered down into tier 4. My favorite's tier 4, and you can see the one that I have highlighted is an M5A1 Stuart. This tank is a tier 4 tank, but as you can see in the garage, it tells you that this tank can play up to a tier 5. So let's step back and let's talk about this. That's true of this specific tank. But for the most part, all tier 4 tanks only play up to tier 5. See that? So even though I've got a few others here selected, they all only play up to tier 5. That means you most likely would never be put in a match where you were facing tier 6 tanks, or tier 7, or tier 8, or tier 9, or tier 10. You get it, right? That's the highest tank tier that you would play against if you picked and took this tank into battle. Now, that doesn't mean that that's the only tier that you'll play. The match that you get might have tier 5s in it, it might have tier 4s, and it might even have tier 3 tanks in it. So just know that there's going to be a range of tiers when you go in to a specific battle. And you'll hear people refer to this in certain terms, and the terms that I want to introduce to you is the +1, -1 matchmaking, or +2, -2 matchmaking, or combinations thereof. So tier 1 through 4, tanks that are in tiers 1 through 4 are only +1, -1 matchmaking, which means they only play up 1 tier and will only play against tanks down 1 tier. So in our case, in our example here, where we're selecting tier 4 tanks, that means we're going to play up to 5 and play down to 3. Now, if I picked a tier 3 tank, it would only play up to tier 4 and only down to tier 2. And if I picked a tier 2 tank, like same thing, it's only +1 and -1 are going to be the range of tanks that I'll play against. And that's referred to, again, as +1, -1 matchmaking. And the reason I highlight this is sometimes, on special occasions, Wargaming will turn on +1, -1 matchmaking for all tanks. So in other tiers where this is not the case, you have, in fact, let's talk about tiers 5 through 10. Tiers 5 through 10 have +2, -2 matchmaking. That means they will play up 2 tiers and they will play down 2 tiers. So if you're in a tier 5 tank, well, the tier 5 kind of violates that, but let's talk about that. Tier 5, you would play +2, which is up to tier 7, and you would play generally down -2. Well, that's not true in tier 5 because of tier 4, right? And tier 3 rules. Tier 5 only plays against tier 4 at its lowest. So it's really +2, -1 in tier 5. Tier 6 is truly +2, -2. No, not true. you thought I would make a mistake there. Tier 6 only plays +2, -1. So tier 6 goes up to tier 8 for its highest grouping, but goes down to tier 5. So tier 6 never plays tier 4s. Why? Because tier 4s are only +1, -1. So tier 4, it'd be unfair for tier 4s to get stuck in a tier 6 match. So that's why tier 6 doesn't have -2. So tier 5s and 6 are +2, -1 generally, and tiers 7, 8 are the only true 7 and 8 are the only true +2, -2 tiers. So if you think about it, most tanks are a plus or -1 in some way, right? Generally, the 7 and 8 tier are the ones that actually get that wider range. They will actually play down. Tier 7 will actually play down to a tier 5, and tier 7 will actually be able to play up into a tier 9. Now, this is generally speaking that these tanks have this kind of matchmaking. Tier 8, same thing, +2, -2. Tier 9 is a +1, -2. Because there's only 10 tiers in the World War II mode, you will only play up to tier 10 in a tier 9 tank. And you will play down, you can play against 7, so it's a -2, but it's a +1 up. And then, of course, tier 10 is a +0 because you only can go up to 10, so you will always be the top tier if you're playing tier 10 tanks, and then you will play down potentially 2 tanks, so you can play against tier 8s and tier 9s. So that's the range of each tier, generally speaking. Now, within that matchmaking, there are certain tanks, let's call them special tanks, and there's a specific term for it. I'm going to share that in a minute, that only play up to certain tiers, and so they're unique, and they are considered preferential matchmaking tanks. I'll do a video, I think, probably listing all the preferential matchmaking tanks. There's quite a few of them, but an example would be let's say a tier 5 Bogatyr off the top of my head. It's a Russian heavy tank. Even though it's a tier 5 tank, normally tier 5 could play up to tier 7, right? But because the Bogatyr is a preferential matchmaking tank, if you're entering that match by yourself in your Bogatyr, then you're not going to play tier 7s. It will keep you from playing matches at tier 7. You'll only play 6s, 5s, and potentially 4s. So that's an example of a preferential matchmaking tank, and that there's certain very specific tanks that do restrict the number of tiers they play up. Now, the reason they restrict the tiers you play up is the thought process is when you play up against certain tanks, that means that they're going to have more strengths. Their strengths and weaknesses are going to be better than yours, right? And so the natural tendency is to try to minimize playing against stronger tanks. Now, the downside is that you don't have as much damage to get. Those higher tier tanks have more hit points, and they can potentially yield more damage for you. If you're a good player, then you tend to want to see more damage, and you don't mind playing uh, mediocre players that play higher tiers. You'll certainly take your lower tier and be just fine. But in general, people that are starting out playing World of Tanks and getting better need to understand the concept of playing certain tiers and what that means when you play certain tiers and the opportunity it means to not play some of the better tanks in the game. So that's why in my general tips, I've told you to play low tiers until you master all the concepts, is because at low tier, it's guaranteeing you a +1, -1 matchmaking experience, and you will never have to try to struggle against a tier tank that is 2 tiers higher than the tank that you're trying to play. So that's important. This is matchmaking concept is important to understand and to learn. A little note for maybe some more veteran players that or people that certainly have tiers 1, 2, and I think it even works at tier 3 this way. Um, but usually you'll get matches if you play 2 successive matches where you've played up to let's say I have a tier 3 tank and I've played 2 matches where I've had to fight tier 4. That third match I play will be a guaranteed tier 3 match. And that's true of tier 2 and 1 as well. So there's even more advantage by sticking to tiers 3, 2, and 1 for newer players because you always that third match you're going to get a match where you're only playing tanks kind of as good as your tank, and so it gives you that opportunity to hone your skills without trying to play not only against other players that might be better than you, but also against tanks that might be better than your tank. So just knowing that and how to understand matchmaking and select the tanks you play, it's always good for you to consider that. So let's see. I think that's all I want to talk about for matchmaking. So we'll cut this video. Hopefully this was helpful. If it was, hit the like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that bell for notifications for future videos I might do. I want to thank you, of course, for your time. And as always, we'll see you in the next one.